Sister, you had the human first, but he's in my tent tonight. Adrian Calloway braced his back against the trunk of a peculiar tree whose obsidian-like bark felt oddly warm beneath his palm. The branches overhead shimmered with translucent leaves, each filtering the dying sunlight into prismatic beams that danced across the ground. He stood at the outskirts of a newly established perimeter around the tribe's settlement, carefully inspecting a damaged energy conduit. The lines hummed with a pulse he'd grown accustomed to, a soft throb that reminded him of a heartbeat. It was the very system that powered everything here: lights, defense grids, and the specialized equipment that made life possible in this rugged land. He knelt to examine the severed cable, tapping his calloused fingers against the metal in that rhythmic pattern he always defaulted to when anxious. Ever since he was a boy on Earth, that simple drumming motion was his anchor, a way to quiet the storm of thoughts in his head. He let out a slow breath, his dark brown eyes scanning the intricate network of wires. It was clear the damage had been done by something with formidable strength, judging by the deep claw marks etched into the metal casing. His hair, thick and curly, fell forward over his forehead, and he pushed it back absently, leaving a smudge of dust on his cheek. His shirt was smeared with grime from days of hard labor, but he barely noticed any more. For Adrien, survival and utility had become far more important than appearances, ever since his family had been lost to a climate disaster on Earth. The memory of that day still haunted him. The unstoppable storm surge, the crumbling sea walls, and the helplessness that had swallowed him whole. From that moment on, he had promised himself never to become too attached to anything or anyone again. Yet here he was, risking everything on a distant planet whose name he could barely pronounce, drawn by the promise of an engineering contract that might secure him a future free from Earth's endless catastrophes. The tribe that lived here, known for their reverence of the land's energy wells, had welcomed him with cautious acceptance, mostly because of his expertise in repairing alien systems. But there were secrets within this tribe, especially between two sisters who had caught his eye from the start. He thought about them now, about the way one sister's gaze was always sharp and protective, while the other's was playful and challenging. He couldn't deny that he was intrigued, and that intrigue made him uneasy, as it stood at odds with the vow he had made to keep himself from forming deep attachments. A sudden crackling in the nearby brush pulled him from his thoughts. He lifted his head, scanning the twilight gloom. The forest's natural hush was replaced by a creeping sense of danger. The leaves, translucent and prismatic, seemed to refract the faint evening light into shards of color that danced across the forest floor. For a moment, Adrien wondered if it was just his imagination. Then he heard the low, rasping hiss that had become all too familiar in recent days. The shardbacks, alien creatures that possessed insectoid limbs fused with reptilian features, had been making increasingly bold incursions into this territory. Their crystalline scales caught the light, giving them an uncanny, fractured gleam. He'd seen them tear through metal and flesh with equal ease. Adrian's muscles tensed. He slid the small energy blade from his tool belt, a weapon he'd cobbled together by adapting the tribe's technology. The blade flickered with a faint, ember-like glow. Though he was no trained warrior, he wasn't entirely helpless either. He braced himself, scanning the undergrowth for movement. His heart hammered in his chest, recalling the times he had encountered these creatures before. Their cunning seemed to grow with each attack. No longer were they random predators. They were strategic, almost as if guided by a higher intelligence. A shape emerged from behind a low-slung boulder. Glinting, jagged scales reflected the last rays of the setting sun, giving the creature an eerie, multifaceted appearance. Its eyes, set on either side of its angular head, fixated on Adrien. He knew that if it charged, he would have precious few seconds to react. Slowly, he rose from his crouch, shifting his weight to the balls of his feet. He refused to let fear rule him, though adrenaline spiked through his veins. He was an engineer, not a soldier, but he'd learned to adapt quickly or die trying. Before the shardback could lunge, two silhouettes cut through the gloom behind it. One moved with a lithe grace, silent as a shadow, the other with poised strength and a hunter's confidence. Adrien felt a wave of relief, tinged with awe. The sisters had come. Reh'ka, with her forest-green skin that looked as though it were carved from polished jade, darted forward. She gripped a slender spear, its blade shimmering like tempered glass. Her black hair fell straight down her back, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it, and her onyx eyes were narrowed in concentration. Meanwhile, Vey'na, skin a soft lavender, rippling with subtle iridescence, moved in tandem, circling the beast from the opposite side. Her own dark hair glinted with faint silvery streaks when the dying sunlight hit it, and her pale violet eyes had an intensity that belied her smaller stature. Reh'ka struck first, thrusting her spear at the shardback's flank. The creature screeched, crystalline scales scraping against the spear's tip. Vey'na seized the opening, her blade sliding between two plates of scale. She moved with uncanny silence, each step precise, as though she were dancing rather than fighting. Adrien, adrenaline surging, joined the fray. With a practiced motion, he activated the energy blade in his hand, driving it into the beast's underbelly. Sparks arced along its body, and the shardback howled. The combined force of their strikes brought it crashing to the ground, its limbs twitching in a final spasm. The sisters stood over the creature, catching their breath. Reh'ka's eyes flicked to Adrien, then back to Vey'na. Adrien noticed the subtle tension between them, a tension that went beyond the battle. He didn't know the full story, but he sensed their dynamic was more complicated than mere sibling rivalry. He also caught the way Reh'ka's chest rose and fell, the silver root-like lines under her green skin pulsing with her heartbeat. Vey'na, too, had a flush along her lavender cheeks, a mix of adrenaline and something else. Adrien wiped sweat from his brow and surveyed the dead shardback. "Thanks for the assist," he said, his voice carrying the unsteady relief of having just survived another brush with death. He tried to keep it light, but the seriousness of the situation weighed heavily on them all. "If you two hadn't shown up—" Vey'na tilted her head, narrowing her pale violet eyes at him in that predatory way that both intrigued and unsettled him. "You would have managed," she said softly, though there was a hint of teasing in her tone. "Or you would have tried." Reh'ka, on the other hand, was more reserved. She merely nodded, her onyx gaze lingering on Adrien. "It's our duty to keep the perimeter safe. You were outside it. We keep watch." Her voice was steady, carrying the quiet authority he'd come to associate with her. She was the eldest sister, the one the tribe looked to for leadership. Even in this brief exchange, he could sense her protectiveness and the weight of expectation on her shoulders. Adrien knelt by the carcass, curiosity driving him to examine the crystalline scales more closely. "They're getting bolder," he remarked, running his fingers over the jagged surface. "I've been trying to repair the conduit so we can strengthen the energy field, but they keep damaging the lines. They're not just attacking at random, they're targeting our infrastructure." He paused, glancing up at the sisters. "Or maybe yours, I should say." Vey'na's eyes flickered, a hint of annoyance crossing her features. "It is ours," she said, her voice carrying a slight edge. "But you're part of it now. Or at least you're trying to be." Then she shrugged, the tension slipping away as quickly as it had come. "We need your skills. You need our protection. It seems a fair trade." Reh'ka stepped forward, planting her spear into the ground. The quiet hum of the environment enveloped them, the chirps of nocturnal creatures, the distant rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. The forest was alive in a way that Earth's battered ecosystems no longer were. Adrien found it both beautiful and haunting, a reminder of what his homeworld had lost. "We should return," Reh'ka said, looking from Adrien to Vey'na. "It's not safe here after dark, and we need to inform the elders that the shardbacks are pressing closer." The three of them made their way back through the trees, stepping carefully over twisting roots that glowed with faint lines of energy. In the distance, the village came into view, illuminated by the subtle radiance of the energy wells. The dwellings were made of a stone-like material that shimmered under the night sky, giving the settlement an ethereal quality. Some huts had taut, tented roofs, crafted from hides that glistened like hammered copper. Others were carved directly into rock formations, their entrances covered by woven curtains. Everything here seemed to merge with the land rather than dominate it. As they approached, members of the tribe turned to greet them. Their skin tones varied across greens, purples, and occasionally other colors that Adrien couldn't name, each with patterns or faint mineral-like textures unique to their lineage. Children with wide, curious eyes peered from behind their parents, while elders with lines etched into their skin murmured quiet greetings. Adrien felt a mixture of acceptance and distance. He was needed for his engineering prowess, but he was still an outsider. Reh'ka and Vey'na led him to a communal fire pit at the settlement's center. Flames danced over stones, casting elongated shadows across the ground. He could see that the tribe members took comfort in their daily rituals, in the warmth of shared meals and stories. For a moment, he longed for the sense of belonging he'd lost on Earth, the sense of a real home. But then the old fear crept back. Attachments meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had cost him dearly before. They reported the Shardback incident to the elders, and a serious hush fell over the gathering. Talk began about reinforcing the perimeter, doubling watch shifts, and ensuring the energy wells remained protected. Adrien listened carefully, contributing where he could. He explained that if he could repair the main conduit and reroute some of the power flow, they might be able to create a stronger barrier that would repel the Shardbacks, or at least slow them down. The elders nodded gravely, their expressions thoughtful. Vey'na stood near him, arms folded. She seemed restless, like she was ready to slip away into the night for another scouting mission. Reh'ka, meanwhile, took her role as the eldest sister seriously, answering questions from the elders with a calm, measured tone. Adrien noticed how the two of them were always aware of each other's presence, as though they were connected by an invisible thread. Sometimes they would exchange a glance, quick, charged with meaning, and he felt like an intruder on a private conversation he couldn't hear. After the meeting concluded, Reh'ka approached him. Her posture was confident but reserved, her onyx eyes steady. "Thank you for your help today," she said, her voice low. "Your presence might have saved a life, or more than one." Adrien rubbed the back of his neck, a little flustered by her directness. "I was just doing what I could. We all have something to lose if the Shardbacks break through." She nodded, then paused. "There's a tent prepared for you near the western edge of the settlement. The watchers keep close guard there. You'll be safe." He glanced toward the rows of tents, where the flicker of torches cast dancing shadows across the canvas. "Thank you," he replied. Then, with a slight hesitation, he asked, "What about you and Vey'na?" A flicker of something, pride or maybe concern, crossed her face. "We have our own tents, but we're often out on patrol. There's no shortage of danger." He nodded, feeling the weight of unspoken words between them. Before he could say anything else, Vey'na appeared behind Reh'ka, silent as ever. She gave Adrien a sidelong glance and said, "Be careful. The nights here can be full of surprises." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing with Reh'ka in the firelight. The tension in the air was palpable, but Reh'ka simply bowed her head and excused herself. Adrien watched them go, their forms disappearing into the maze of tents and stone dwellings. A subtle pang of longing stirred in him, surprising him with its intensity. He had tried so hard to remain detached, yet he found himself drawn to both sisters for different reasons. Reh'ka's unwavering sense of duty and quiet strength contrasted sharply with Vey'na's free-spirited grace and sharp wit. The conflict between them was almost tangible, and he sensed that he was at the center of it in some inexplicable way. He retreated to his assigned tent, where a soft pallet awaited him. The canvas walls were made of a material that reflected the faint starlight, creating a dim glow inside. Though exhaustion weighed on him, his mind refused to quiet. He kept replaying the moment of the battle, the synergy they had achieved when fighting the Shardback. They had moved like a single unit, each complementing the other's strengths. Adrien with his improvised energy blade, Reh'ka with her calculated spear strikes, and Vey'na with her stealthy precision. The memory of that unity warmed him, and yet he couldn't shake the sense of unease about the growing threat. The Shardbacks weren't just wild animals. They were organized, adapting, and somewhere in that realization lay a larger danger he couldn't yet fully grasp. Eventually, he dozed off, haunted by dreams of Earth's crumbling coastlines merging with the crystal scales of the Shardbacks. He dreamt of storms and broken walls, of swirling waters and jagged teeth. When he woke in a cold sweat, he realized it was still the middle of the night. The hum of the energy wells vibrated softly through the ground, a reminder that this alien land had its own heartbeat, its own spirit. He sat up, running a hand over his face, and decided to step outside for some air. The settlement at night was a tapestry of subtle glimmers. The canvas tents seemed to breathe, shifting gently with the wind. Faint lines of energy traced through the ground, glowing like molten ore beneath the surface. In the distance, the silhouette of the sacred energy well rose against the stars, framed by rock formations that shimmered like polished stone. Adrien found himself wandering toward that well, drawn by the gentle hum that resonated in his chest. He reached a rocky ledge overlooking the well and stopped short when he noticed another figure already there. Vey'na stood at the edge, her lavender skin catching the starlight in a faint shimmer. She seemed lost in thought, her arms folded around herself as though warding off a chill. Adrien considered turning back, not wanting to intrude, but something in her posture made him stay. He cleared his throat softly to announce his presence. She turned, and her pale violet eyes widened for a heartbeat before narrowing in that curious, almost predatory way. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, stepping closer until he stood beside her, both of them gazing down at the well. "Nightmares," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "Sometimes I still see the floods. From Earth. It's been years, but it doesn't really go away." She studied him, her head tilted. "The memory of tragedy lingers. Here, too, we have lost much." Her gaze flicked to the well, whose faint glow lit the planes of her face. "My people believe these wells are the spirits of our ancestors, giving us life, guiding us. If they fail, we fail." Adrien nodded. "That's why we have to protect them from the Shardbacks." Her lips curved into a wry smile. "You say that as if it's so simple." She turned to face him fully, the gentle light illuminating the quartz-like striations that ran across her cheeks. "But I think you understand complexity. You are an outsider, yet you try to fix what is broken. You fight beside us, yet you keep part of yourself locked away. Why?" He inhaled, the chill night air filling his lungs. "I've lost people," he said quietly. "I don't want to feel that kind of pain again. Getting close to someone means risking that loss." Vey'na's gaze softened, her earlier edge tempered by empathy. "We all risk loss," she said, "but the alternative is a life half-lived." She took a step closer, and he could see the faint shimmer along her collarbone, where the night air raised goosebumps on her skin. "I've seen the way you look at me, and at my sister. You're not as distant as you pretend to be." Adrien felt heat rising to his face, a mixture of embarrassment and attraction. "I don't know what you mean," he said, though it was a half-hearted denial at best. She smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "It's all right to want something for yourself, Adrien." Then, surprising him, she reached out and placed a hand on his cheek. The touch was warm, and her eyes flickered with a delicate mixture of curiosity and desire. He found himself leaning into her palm, heart pounding. She leaned closer, her breath mingling with his in the cool night air, and pressed her lips to his in a tentative, lingering kiss. For a moment time seemed to suspend. The hum of the energy well, the distant rustle of leaves, the faint chirps of nocturnal creatures, everything faded into the background. He tasted the faint salt of her skin and felt the electric thrill of that connection he'd been avoiding. When she pulled back, he was left breathless and conflicted, the old fear clashing with a surge of longing he hadn't felt in years. Before either of them could speak, a shadow fell across them. Reh'ka stood a few paces away, her posture stiff, her onyx eyes reflecting a storm of emotions. Adrian's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure how long she'd been there, but it was clear she had seen enough. Vey'na stepped away, her expression momentarily stricken. Reh'ka regarded them both in silence, the silver veins under her green skin pulsing more visibly than usual, betraying her heightened state. Adrien opened his mouth to explain, but Reh'ka turned on her heel and strode away into the darkness, her spear strapped across her back. Vey'na let out a soft sigh, glancing at Adrien with a look that conveyed both apology and a kind of resignation. "She'll be angry," she said. "With you. With me, maybe with herself." She paused, then added in a near whisper, "We were close once, but I've always been the younger one, the one who follows. Sometimes I think she resents me for wanting more than just her shadow." Adrien swallowed hard, feeling a rush of guilt. "I didn't mean—" Vey'na lifted a hand, silencing him. "I know, but this is our way. Tension is part of life. We'll face it, just like we face the shardbacks." She gave him a final lingering glance, then slipped away into the night, leaving him alone on the rocky ledge with his racing thoughts. He stared after her, torn between the afterglow of that unexpected kiss and the dread of what Reh'ka must be feeling. The old vow he had made echoed in his mind. Never let yourself get too close. Yet here he was, entangled in a conflict he hadn't foreseen. The sky above was a sprawl of stars, clearer than any night sky on Earth had been in decades, but the vastness only made him feel more isolated. Eventually, he returned to his tent, though sleep was a distant hope. He lay awake, wrestling with the realization that, despite his best efforts, he was getting pulled deeper into the sister's world, and deeper into his own heart's unsteady desires. Morning arrived with the soft luminescence of dawn creeping across the alien sky. Adrien emerged from his tent, bleary-eyed, and found the village already stirring. The tribe's people went about their tasks with a purposeful quiet, gathering supplies, preparing meals, and checking the perimeter. He noticed that Reh'ka and Vey'na were nowhere in sight, which sent a small pang of disappointment and relief through him. He made his way to the main conduit, determined to finish the repairs he'd started. The device was located at the edge of the settlement, where the forest gave way to rocky terrain pockmarked with shimmering mineral deposits. He knelt and resumed his work, carefully splicing wires and rerouting power to create a more stable flow. As he worked, he tried to focus on the mechanical logic of the system, rather than the tangle of emotions in his chest. Hours passed. He managed to coax the conduit back into operation, hearing the reassuring thrum of energy coursing through the lines. The field that protected the settlement flickered briefly, then stabilized, casting a faint protective dome over the area. Satisfied with his progress, Adrien stood and wiped sweat from his brow, only to hear a voice behind him. "You're handy with those wires." Reh'ka's tone was even, but he could see a shadow of tension in her eyes. He turned, forcing a small smile. "Engineering is what I do best." She studied him for a moment, arms folded. He couldn't help but notice how the sunlight caught the delicate silver veins beneath her green skin, highlighting her muscle definition and the poised strength in her posture. He also noticed the faint lines of exhaustion under her eyes, as though she hadn't slept well either. "I appreciate your work," she said at last. "The field will help keep the shardbacks at bay." Adrien nodded, feeling awkward but relieved that she wasn't outright furious with him. "I hope so. They seem to be learning how to bypass certain defenses, though. We need to stay vigilant." Reh'ka glanced at the horizon, where clouds of dust hinted at possible movement. "I've already sent scouts. If the shardbacks are gathering, we'll know soon." She shifted her gaze back to Adrien. "About last night," she trailed off, and for a moment he thought she might confront him about the kiss she had witnessed. Instead, she said, "You should be careful with Vey'na. She can be impulsive, and sometimes that leads to trouble." Her words stung more than he expected. He cleared his throat. "I don't think she's as reckless as you believe. She's capable." Reh'ka's jaw tightened. "I never said she wasn't capable, but there's more at stake than just her skills." She paused, then exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "I'm responsible for her. It's been that way since we were children. Our parents died when she was still young. I had to learn how to protect her, how to keep our family names strong." Her gaze dropped to the ground, and she traced a line in the dust with her foot. "Sometimes I forget that she's not a child anymore." Adrien felt a pang of empathy. He understood the burden of responsibility, though in a different context. "It's not easy letting go," he said quietly, thinking of the moment he had lost his own family. "But maybe you don't have to protect her from everything. Sometimes people have to face risks to grow." Reh'ka's eyes flicked to him, unreadable. "I see you've grown fond of giving advice." But there was no malice in her tone, only a sort of resigned acceptance. She turned to leave, then paused. "We're planning to send a team to the old outpost in the ravine to reinforce it. The shardbacks have been sighted there. We could use your engineering skills." She hesitated, then added in a softer voice, "Join us." He nodded. "I will." As she walked away, he felt a tug of something deeper than mere respect. There was an unspoken understanding forming between them, despite the unresolved tension about Vey'na. He wondered if Reh'ka felt it too. Later that day, Adrien found himself traveling with a small group toward the ravine. The landscape changed from dense forest to a more rocky expanse, with steep cliffs that glinted like glass under the midday sun. Vey'na was part of the team, and she kept her distance from Adrien, though occasionally their eyes would meet. Each time his heart would skip a beat, recalling the taste of her lips under the starlight. Reh'ka led the group, her stance confident as she navigated the uneven terrain. If she was bothered by Adrien's presence near her sister, she kept it to herself, focusing on the mission. They reached the old outpost, a structure carved into the side of a cliff. The walls were made of the same stone-like material that composed the dwellings in the village, but here it was cracked and weather-worn. The outpost's main function had been to monitor the flow of energy through underground channels, but it had fallen into disuse when the tribe consolidated closer to the wells. Now, with the shardback threat growing, the tribe needed every vantage point they could get. Inside, Adrien immediately went to work, testing the dormant equipment. Dust coated the consoles, and spiderweb-like patterns of energy lines ran through the walls, most of them inactive. Vey'na joined him, watching quietly as he pried open a panel to inspect the wiring. He was aware of her presence, acutely so, and the silence between them felt charged. At length, she spoke. "Reh'ka didn't want me to come on this mission. She thinks I take too many risks." Adrien paused, glancing at her. "She worries about you." Vey'na huffed softly. "I know, but her worry feels like a chain sometimes." She crouched beside him, her slender fingers brushing dust from a corroded circuit board. The quartz-like striations in her skin caught the dim light, sending subtle reflections onto the console. "When I was little, I adored her. She was everything to me, mother, father, sister, teacher. But as I grew older, I realized I didn't want to live in her shadow. I wanted to see the world on my own terms." Adrien listened, feeling a swell of sympathy. "That's not unreasonable. You have a right to make your own path." She looked at him, her pale violet eyes intense. "I do. But Reh'ka still sees me as that child who needed constant care. And maybe I resent her a little for being so perfect in everyone's eyes." She turned her gaze back to the circuit board, fiddling with a loose wire. "She's the strong one, the responsible one. I'm the impulsive younger sister who can't be trusted." He set down his tools, placing a hand on her shoulder. "That's not how I see you." A faint smile curved her lips. "I know. And that's why—" She trailed off, her expression turning contemplative. That's why I kissed you, I suppose. You look at me and see an equal. He swallowed, remembering the soft press of her lips. It meant something to me, too, he admitted, his voice low, but I also don't want to cause trouble between you and Reh'ka. Her smile vanished, replaced by a resigned sadness. That trouble has been there for a long time. You're just a new element in an old conflict. She rose to her feet, dusting off her hands. We should finish this work before nightfall. They set to the task of reactivating the outpost's power. Adrien managed to reroute a few functional circuits, and soon a soft glow lit the corridors. Reh'ka approached, her gaze shifting between Adrien and Vey'na. We'll need to secure the perimeter, she said, her tone all business. Adrien, can you tie this system into the main network so we can monitor from the village? He nodded. Yes, but I'll need some time, maybe an hour or two. She turned to Vey'na. Help me check the outer defenses. We'll make sure there are no signs of shardbacks nearby. Vey'na inclined her head in agreement, and the sisters moved off. Adrien exhaled, focusing on the console to keep his mind from spiraling into the complexity of their dynamic. But as he worked, he couldn't help but wonder how he'd gotten so deeply entangled with these two remarkable women. His old fears still whispered in the back of his mind, warning him of the pain that came from caring too much. Yet every time he recalled the warmth of Vey'na's kiss or the quiet intensity in Reh'ka's eyes, he felt a pull he couldn't resist. Night fell swiftly in this region. By the time Adrien finished the repairs, darkness had draped the ravine, and the group decided to spend the night at the outpost rather than risk traveling back. They lit torches and set up a makeshift camp in the courtyard, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the weathered stone walls. The air was cool, carrying the scent of mineral-rich rock and the faint tang of distant vegetation. Adrien found himself seated near one of the fires, checking over his tools and writing notes on a small data pad. Reh'ka joined him, silent at first, gazing into the flames. He could sense she had something on her mind, so he waited. Eventually, she spoke. I heard you and Vey'na talking earlier. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but sound carries in these halls. She paused, as though measuring her words. You should know that whatever happens between you and her, it won't be simple. He met her gaze, noticing the tension in her jaw. I understand that. She nodded slowly. Vey'na has always wanted to prove herself. Sometimes she takes risks that others wouldn't. She hesitated, then added, but maybe that's what makes her stronger than we realize. Adrien studied her face, the silver lines beneath her green skin shimmering in the firelight. You care for her deeply, he said. I can see that, but she's not the only one who's living under pressure. You've had to shoulder the burden of leadership for a long time, haven't you? Her lips pressed into a thin line. It's what is expected. I am the eldest, the one who must hold the family's honor. If I fail, it shames not just me but my parents' memory, our ancestors, and Vey'na as well. She ran a hand through her long black hair, exhaling. Sometimes I envy her freedom, her willingness to step outside the lines, but I can't let myself do the same. My people depend on me. A moment of silence passed, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Adrien reached out and gently placed his hand on hers. She didn't pull away. You deserve to want things for yourself, he said softly. Being responsible doesn't mean you can't have your own desires, your own happiness. Her gaze flicked to his hand, then back to his face. And what if my desires conflict with my duty? He swallowed, recalling the flash of jealousy in her eyes when she had seen him with Vey'na. Maybe you can find a balance, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. The question lingered between them, unresolved. After a beat, she squeezed his hand, then stood, leaving him to wrestle with his own uncertainties. The night passed fitfully. Adrien slept in one of the old bunk rooms, the walls echoing every sound, the wind whistling through cracks in the stone, the faint shifting of the others as they tried to rest. He dreamt of earth again, but this time the waters were laced with shards of crystal, and when he reached out for help, he saw both sisters standing on the shore. He woke with a start, a sheen of sweat on his brow. Morning came, bringing a chill wind that swept through the ravine. Adrien stepped outside to find Reh'ka and Vey'na already organizing the group for the return journey. He joined them, noting the subtle glances they exchanged, an unspoken communication that only siblings seemed to share. They set out together, following the winding path that led back to the village. The trek was uneventful at first, until they reached a narrow pass where the cliffs rose steeply on either side. The group halted at a sudden noise, skittering, scraping, an echo that bounced between the walls. Adrien felt the hairs on his neck stand up. Reh'ka gestured for silence, and Vey'na slipped forward like a ghost, peering around a bend in the path. She returned quickly, her voice hushed. Shardbacks, several of them, possibly more. They're clustered around something. It looks like a broken piece of one of our scanning devices. Adrian's heart pounded. They're scavenging our tech? Reh'ka's eyes narrowed. That means they're learning. This is worse than we thought. They formed a plan. Adrien would try to rig a small energy pulse bomb from the materials in his pack, something that would create a localized burst to disorient the creatures. Meanwhile, Reh'ka and Vey'na would position themselves on opposite sides of the pass, ready to strike if the creatures rushed them. The rest of the group would hold back, covering their retreat if things went wrong. Adrien worked quickly, hands shaking with adrenaline as he cobbled together a crude device. The idea was to use a small power cell, wire it to overload, and time the detonation with a makeshift fuse. Vey'na crouched beside him, her lavender skin brushing against his arm as she handed him tools. She hummed softly under her breath, that low, resonant tune that reminded him of wind through canyons. It was the first time he'd heard her do it, and he realized it was the same tune Reh'ka hummed when anxious, a family trait, perhaps. Finally, the device was ready. Adrien looked into Vey'na's eyes. I'll throw this as close to them as I can. We'll have about 10 seconds before it goes off. She nodded, slipping away to take her position. Reh'ka caught Adrien's eye from the other side of the pass, her spear at the ready. He gave a curt nod, then edged forward. The shardbacks came into view, a cluster of 6 or 7, their crystalline scales reflecting the dim morning light. They were gathered around a small metal sphere, a piece of scanning equipment from the outpost, half buried in the dirt. One of the creatures lifted it in its clawed hand, tilting it as though trying to understand its purpose. Adrien's heart hammered in his chest. He had to time this perfectly. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the activation switch on the device, counted to 3, then hurled it. The small contraption landed among the shardbacks, bouncing once on the rocky ground. For a split second, the creatures paused, heads swiveling toward the object. Then Adrien dove behind a boulder. A flash of bright energy lit the pass, followed by a thunderous crack. The shardbacks screeched, their crystalline scales refracting the burst of light into a chaotic rainbow. Reh'ka and Vey'na struck in that moment of confusion, each attacking from a different side. Spears and blades found gaps in the creature's defenses, and the rest of the group joined the assault with bows and energy lances. The battle was fierce, but brief. Disoriented by the pulse, the shardbacks couldn't mount an organized defense. One by one, they fell, their scaled bodies crashing onto the rocky ground. When the dust settled, Adrien emerged from behind the boulder, heart still racing. Reh'ka was kneeling over one of the fallen creatures, inspecting something embedded in its scales. Vey'na stood nearby, breathing hard, her blade slick with the creature's dark ichor. Adrien approached, feeling a sick twist in his stomach. "What is that?" he asked, pointing to the metallic object Reh'ka held. She turned it over in her hand, her onyx eyes narrowing. "Some kind of implant. I've never seen anything like it." And she pried it free from the shardback's scale, revealing a small circuit board etched with alien symbols. "This isn't just a random adaptation. Someone's controlling them." Vey'na's gaze flicked between the device and Adrien's face. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "They're not just wild beasts. They're tools in someone's plan. Adrien felt a surge of alarm, which means the attacks on the settlement might be orchestrated by something or someone who wants to sabotage the energy wells. Reh'ka stood, her face grim. We need to bring this to the elders. If there's another faction out there manipulating the shardbacks, we have a much bigger problem than we realized. The group hastily buried the dead creatures and set off for the village, minds buzzing with the implications of their discovery. Adrien walked in silence, trying to process the sudden shift in what he thought he knew. The shardbacks had seemed like a natural predator, albeit an unusually adaptive one. Now, the presence of this device suggested a larger threat looming over them all. He stole a glance at Reh'ka and Vey'na, wondering how this revelation would affect the delicate balance between them. By the time they reached the village, the sun was high. The elders convened quickly, alarmed by the news. Adrien, Reh'ka, and Vey'na explained what they had found. The atmosphere in the communal area was tense, heavy with fear and uncertainty. Some whispered about ancient rivalries with neighboring tribes. Others speculated about off-world smugglers seeking to harness the well's energy for profit. Whatever the truth, it was clear that the threat was far more sophisticated than anyone had guessed. After the meeting, Adrien retreated to his tent, head spinning. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Reh'ka. She looked tired, the lines of stress more evident than ever. "I want you to come with me on a scouting mission," she said. "We'll head into the deeper caves near the wells, see if there's any sign of tampering. If these implants are being made somewhere, we need to find out." He hesitated. "Shouldn't Vey'na come too?" Reh'ka shook her head. "I asked her to stay behind and guard the settlement. She's better at infiltration. But we need someone here who can move unseen if trouble arrives at our doorstep. You and I can handle the caves." Adrien nodded, though part of him felt uneasy about leaving Vey'na behind. Still, Reh'ka was the eldest sister, and her authority in the tribe was significant. He packed his gear, including a portable scanning device he'd been tinkering with, then followed her out of the settlement. The journey took them through winding paths that skirted the main wells. The energy in this area was palpable, the ground warm to the touch, and occasional flickers of light shimmered beneath the stone like veins of molten ore. They descended into a network of caves that glowed with a faint inner radiance. The walls were smooth in some places, etched with tribal symbols in others. Adrian's scanning device picked up subtle energy fluctuations, suggesting there might be more channels beneath the surface. Reh'ka moved with quiet confidence, her spear held at the ready. He found himself watching her, admiring the interplay of light on her green skin. The way her black hair fell across her shoulders, she was formidable, and he respected her deeply. Yet he also sensed a vulnerability in her, one that she rarely let anyone see. At length, they reached a cavern where water trickled from cracks in the ceiling, pooling into a small, clear pond at the center. The air was cooler here, and the echoes of their footsteps lingered. Reh'ka motioned for silence, then led him to a section of wall where the stone seemed freshly chipped. Adrien crouched down, examining the markings. Sure enough, it looked like someone had been mining or excavating the area, leaving behind jagged edges and metal filings. Reh'ka's voice was low. "This is new. Someone is digging near the wells. They might be harvesting the raw materials to make those implants." Adrien's mind raced. If they're building or modifying the shardbacks, they could be doing it in these caves. It's isolated, and it's close to the wells. She nodded, scanning the darkness. "We need to go deeper, see if we can find anything else." They pressed on, the cavern twisting into a series of narrow tunnels. Adrien's heart thumped in his chest. He was keenly aware of Reh'ka's presence beside him, the tension in the air. They squeezed through a tight passage, emerging into a broader chamber lit by strange, flickering crystals embedded in the walls. The crystals pulsed with a muted glow, reminiscent of the energy wells, but fainter, as if artificially activated. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the chamber, a scraping, shifting sound that set both of them on edge. Reh'ka signaled for him to take cover behind a stalagmite while she inched forward. Adrien watched her silhouette as she disappeared around a corner. Moments later, a strangled cry rang out, followed by the sound of a struggle. His blood went cold. He dashed forward, weapon in hand, and found Reh'ka grappling with a figure clad in patchwork armor, a metallic device strapped to their forearm. The figure seemed half human, half alien, with features Adrien didn't recognize. They held a jagged blade to Reh'ka's throat. Adrien acted on instinct. He lunged, swinging his improvised energy blade, forcing the attacker to release Reh'ka. She rolled away, snatching her spear from the ground. The figure hissed something unintelligible and pressed a button on the forearm device. A surge of electric energy arced toward Adrien, crackling through the air. He barely dodged in time, feeling the hairs on his arms stand on end. Reh'ka sprang into action, thrusting her spear. The attacker blocked it with the metal gauntlet, sparks flying. Adrien realized the attacker's device was similar to the implant they had found in the shardback, some advanced tech meant to manipulate energy. As the figure attempted another strike, Adrien rushed forward, driving his shoulder into their chest. The force sent the attacker stumbling. Reh'ka seized the moment, swinging her spear in a powerful arc that knocked the device from the figure's arm, sending it skittering across the cave floor. With a guttural snarl, the attacker spun and fled deeper into the caves. Reh'ka started to chase, but Adrien grabbed her arm. "We don't know what else is down there. We should regroup and bring help." She panted, eyes blazing with anger. "They could escape, or warn whoever else is here." He held her gaze. "We're alone, and we don't know the terrain. If there's a whole group of them, we could be walking into a trap." He could see the conflict in her eyes, duty warring with caution. Finally, she nodded. They retrieved the fallen device, examining it under the glow of the crystals. It was a more complex version of what they'd seen in the shardback, with intricate circuitry and alien markings. Reh'ka frowned, frustration etched into her features. "Someone is orchestrating all this, building an army of shardbacks to attack our wells. We need to warn the tribe." They began the journey back, the mood grim. Reh'ka's neck bore a faint red mark, where the blade had pressed against her skin, a stark reminder of how close she'd come to death. Adrien felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected, along with a pang of guilt for not having arrived a second sooner. As they navigated the winding corridors, he could feel the tension between them shift, as if the near-death experience had stripped away some of the walls. Eventually, they found themselves back in the cavern with the small pond. Reh'ka knelt by the water, dipping her fingers in and washing the dried blood from a shallow cut on her arm. Adrien crouched beside her, his concern evident. "Let me see that." She allowed him to gently examine the cut. It wasn't deep, but it needed cleaning. He took out a small medkit, carefully applying an antiseptic salve. She winced, but didn't pull away. He couldn't help noticing the way her shoulders trembled slightly, a sign that the adrenaline was fading and the reality of the danger was settling in. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice echoing in the cavern. "I'm not used to needing help." He finished bandaging her arm, then met her eyes. Even the strongest need help sometimes. She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "I hate feeling weak." "You're not weak," he said, a hint of emotion creeping into his voice. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Her eyes flicked to his lips, then back to his gaze. "I don't know what this is between us. I only know that when I saw that blade at my throat, I thought about the things I've never let myself have." She paused, swallowing hard. "And you came to mind." Adrien's heart pounded. He reached out, cupping her cheek gently. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. The faint silver lines under her green skin seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, as if echoing the connection passing between them. He leaned in, pressing his lips to hers. Unlike the tentative kiss he'd shared with Vey'na, this one held a deeper intensity, a rush of relief and raw emotion. Reh'ka's arms wrapped around him, pulling him closer, the chill of the cavern offset by the warmth of their shared breath. They sank to the ground beside the pond, the soft drip of water echoing in the background. Her hands roamed his back, his shoulders, as though memorizing the shape of him. He let his fingers slide through her black hair, marveling at the silky texture. Their kisses grew more urgent, fueled by the realization that life could be snatched away at any moment. Clothes rustled as they shifted, seeking closeness, seeking comfort. Their breaths intermingled, and Adrien felt the familiar rush of desire tempered by an unexpected tenderness. When at last they paused, their foreheads rested against each other, hearts pounding in unison. The cave seemed to hold its breath with them, the crystal's glow reflecting off the surface of the water. Reh'ka exhaled, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never expected to feel this, especially not with you, but I can't deny it." He stroked her cheek, a knot of guilt forming in his chest as he remembered Vey'na. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret this moment. "Neither can I," he whispered. They lingered in that intimate space, letting the warmth of their bodies and the quiet of the cavern cocoon them. Eventually, though, the urgency of their mission forced them to separate. They shared one more lingering kiss, then stood, straightening their clothes and steadying their breathing. A silent agreement passed between them. They would face the consequences of this choice together, whatever those might be. The return to the village was tense. Both were acutely aware of what had transpired, and both knew it complicated an already complex situation. When they arrived, they went straight to the elders, presenting the device they had taken from the attacker. The tribe's leaders were alarmed, realizing that the threat was not just from mindless creatures, but from an intelligent force working behind the scenes. Plans were made to bolster defenses, and scouting parties were sent to other known cave systems. Word spread quickly. Vey'na learned of the attack on Reh'ka and Adrien, and her relief at their safe return was mingled with an odd distance. Adrien noticed the way she avoided meeting his gaze, as though she sensed something had shifted. He wanted to talk to her, to explain, but the days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. As tension mounted, the tribe prepared for war. Defenses were reinforced. Watchers patrolled night and day, and Adrien worked tirelessly to upgrade the energy field. Meanwhile, Reh'ka threw herself into leading the warriors, training them to face an enemy that was far more cunning than they had believed. Vey'na focused on stealth operations, slipping beyond the perimeter to gather intelligence. Whenever Adrien caught sight of her, she was in motion, her lavender skin blending with the shadows, her eyes set on some distant objective. They exchanged few words, and the unspoken weight between them grew heavier. One evening, as the sky bled into a deep indigo, Adrien was in his tent, adjusting a set of power cells. The canvas walls glowed faintly from the torches outside, and the hum of the energy wells seemed louder than usual, a steady throb that matched the pulse in his ears. A soft rustle at the entrance caught his attention, and he looked up to see Vey'na standing there, hesitating. He motioned for her to enter. She stepped inside, arms folded, her expression guarded. "I've been scouting," she said simply. "I think I know where they're coming from." He set aside his tools. "Where?" She glanced away, as though mustering the courage to speak. "A hidden network of caves, not far from where you and Reh'ka were attacked. There are signs of excavation, signs that something is being built or modified down there." She paused, taking a deep breath, "and I found evidence that another tribe might be involved. Their markings were on some of the cave walls, though partially scraped away." Adrien felt a chill. "So it's not just a rogue faction. It might be an entire other tribe trying to take over the wells?" Vey'na nodded. "Possibly, or a breakaway group from that tribe. It's hard to be certain." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "We have to confront them before they launch another wave of shardbacks at us." He rose to his feet, searching her face. "Then let's do it. We'll take a team." She shook her head. "No, not yet. We need more information. Charging in blind will get us killed. Her gaze finally met his, and he saw the flicker of pain there. Adrien, I need you to come with me. Tonight, just the two of us. We'll go deeper than I could on my own, gather evidence, and then decide how to strike. His heart thumped. Vey'na, that's dangerous. Reh'ka, her jaw tightened at the mention of her sister. Reh'ka has her own responsibilities. She won't want me going alone, but she won't leave the settlement when an attack could come at any time. She paused, her eyes searching his. I need you. You know these systems. You might recognize the technology if we see it, and... She trailed off, taking another step toward him. And I want to be with you again, away from all these eyes. The confession hung in the air, charged with longing and unresolved feelings. Adrien felt torn. The memory of his intimate moment with Reh'ka was fresh, but so was the memory of Vey'na's kiss. He cared for them both, in different ways. But the tribe was on the brink of war, and if there was a chance to prevent more bloodshed, he couldn't refuse. All right, he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. We go tonight. They set out under the cover of darkness, slipping through the perimeter under the watchful gaze of a guard who owed Vey'na a favor. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they navigated between towering trees with obsidian bark. Moonlight filtered through the translucent leaves, casting shifting mosaics on the ground. Vey'na led the way, her movements silent and precise. Adrien followed, heart pounding with both anticipation and a creeping sense of dread. They reached the mouth of the cave network, a yawning opening in the rocky hillside. Vey'na paused, listening intently, then gestured for Adrien to follow. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls shimmering faintly with hidden energy veins. Their footsteps echoed, each sound magnified. They pressed on, guided by the faint glow of the crystals embedded in the stone. After winding through several passages, they found a large cavern that pulsed with activity. Adrien stifled a gasp as he peered around a stalagmite. A group of alien figures, similar to the one he and Reh'ka had encountered, were gathered around a makeshift workshop. Tables carved from stone held half-assembled devices, while crates of raw minerals lay stacked against the walls. At the center stood a towering figure with charcoal-gray skin and swirling patterns across his shoulders and arms. He barked orders in a language Adrien didn't understand, pointing to a group of caged shardbacks in the corner. Vey'na's grip on Adrien's arm tightened. He could feel her trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. They watched as the figures tinkered with metallic implants, fastening them onto the shardbacks with cruel efficiency. The creatures hissed and thrashed, but the implants seemed to subdue them after a few moments, as though taking control of their minds. Adrien's stomach churned at the sight. They crept closer, hoping to get a better look. Adrien spotted a console that seemed to be controlling the implants, lines of alien script scrolling across a screen. If he could access that console, maybe he could glean valuable information or even sabotage the system. He signaled to Vey'na, pointing to the console. She nodded, slipping into the shadows to create a distraction. Moments later, a muffled clang echoed from the far side of the cavern, drawing the guard's attention. Adrien seized the moment. He darted forward, crouching behind a work table as he made his way toward the console. His heart hammered, each second feeling like an eternity. He reached the device, his hands flying over the controls. Though the symbols were alien, he recognized certain patterns that resembled the stolen scanning tech from the outpost. With a few quick adjustments, he managed to pull up a schematic of the implant network. It was more advanced than he had feared. The implants were designed to override the shardback's natural instincts, linking them into a hive-like collective. And there were hundreds, possibly thousands of them waiting to be deployed. He heard a shout behind him. One of the guards had spotted him. Swearing under his breath, Adrien tried to copy the data onto his handheld scanner. Another shout, louder this time, indicated that more guards were converging on his position. He saw movement in his peripheral vision, Vey'na dashing across the cavern, drawing the guards away with a flurry of quick strikes from her blade. He felt a surge of admiration for her courage and skill. Just as the transfer finished, a gauntleted hand grabbed Adrian's shoulder. He twisted, bringing his elbow up into the attacker's ribs. The guard stumbled, but another rushed in. Adrien was outnumbered. He slashed with his small energy blade, but it fizzled out, the power cell drained. Panic flared. He could see Vey'na fighting desperately, but more figures were closing in. They would be overwhelmed in seconds. Then came a thunderous roar, echoing through the cavern. At first, Adrien thought the shardbacks had broken free, but the figures spun around, their expressions twisting into shock. From a side tunnel, Reh'ka and a group of tribal warriors burst into the chamber, weapons drawn. Reh'ka's spear flashed in the crystal light, her presence like a vengeful storm. The tribe had followed them, or perhaps Reh'ka had suspected Vey'na would attempt something like this and had tracked them. Chaos erupted. The workshop erupted into a full-scale battle. Tribal warriors clashed with the armored figures, while the caged shardbacks screeched and battered at their enclosures. Adrien rushed to Vey'na's side, relief flooding him as he saw she was still fighting. Though her breath came in ragged gasps, Reh'ka engaged the towering grey-skinned leader, her spear meeting his blade in a series of swift, brutal exchanges. Adrien and Vey'na joined the fray, coordinating with the tribal warriors. They fought to keep the guards away from the console, knowing that if the enemy regained control, they could unleash the newly implanted shardbacks. The air was thick with the sounds of metal striking metal, the roars of enraged creatures, and the sharp crackle of energy weapons. In the midst of the chaos, Adrien caught sight of Reh'ka struggling. The grey-skinned leader was powerful, his strikes forcing her back. She parried desperately, sweat beading on her brow. Adrien's chest constricted. Without a second thought, he sprinted forward, hurling himself into the fray. He tackled the leader from behind, knocking him off balance. Reh'ka seized the opportunity, driving her spear through his chest. The leader let out a guttural snarl, then crumpled to the ground. With their leader gone, the remaining guards faltered. The tribal warriors pressed their advantage, cutting them down or forcing them to flee deeper into the caves. The caged shardbacks, now unguarded, thrashed wildly, some managing to break free. One lunged at Adrien, snapping crystalline jaws. He braced himself, but Vey'na was there, her blade flashing as she sliced through the creature's neck. The beast collapsed in a shower of shattered scales. Finally, the cavern fell silent, save for the ragged breathing of the survivors. Reh'ka stood over the body of the grey-skinned leader, her spear trembling in her grip. Vey'na leaned against a stalagmite, panting. Adrien felt exhaustion wash over him like a tidal wave, but also a surge of triumph. They had uncovered the conspiracy and destroyed its mastermind. The tribe would be safe, at least from this threat. Reh'ka approached Adrien, her onyx eyes reflecting relief and lingering adrenaline. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and though her words were few, the gratitude in her gaze spoke volumes. Vey'na joined them, her lavender skin glistening with sweat, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The sisters exchanged a look, part anger, part concern, and part relief. It was clear they still had much to resolve between them, but for now they stood united. Together, they led the warriors back to the village, carrying the stolen tech as evidence. The elders rejoiced at the victory, relief spreading through the settlement. The shardback threat would diminish without the outside manipulation, and the tribe could finally breathe easier. But Adrien, Reh'ka, and Vey'na knew that their personal struggles were far from over. In the days that followed, the tribe began the process of clearing out the remaining enemy enclaves, reclaiming the caves, and freeing any surviving shardbacks from their implants. Adrien worked tirelessly to dismantle the stolen technology and adapt it for the tribe's defense, ensuring that no one could exploit them again. Reh'ka oversaw the warriors, her leadership tempered by a new perspective on her own limitations and the importance of trust. Vey'na, recognized for her pivotal role in exposing the conspiracy, gained a newfound respect within the tribe. Amid these changes, the three of them found moments of quiet. One evening, as the tribe celebrated around the communal fire, Adrien slipped away to a secluded spot beneath a massive tree with obsidian bark. He needed a moment to reflect on how everything had changed. He had come here as a lone engineer, determined never to open his heart again, and now he was bound to this place by more than just duty. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Reh'ka and Vey'na approaching together. His heart skipped a beat. They looked at each other, then at him. Reh'ka spoke first, her voice low. "We need to talk." He nodded, bracing himself. They sank to the ground together, the sisters flanking him. The tree's translucent leaves cast shifting patterns on their faces, a soft tapestry of light and shadow. Vey'na took a deep breath. "We both care for you," she said, her tone tentative, "and we've both shared moments with you. But we can't keep pretending this is normal or easy." Reh'ka exhaled. "I've never been good at sharing anything, especially not something so important. But you're important to us both, in different ways." Adrien felt a lump in his throat. He looked from one sister to the other. "I care for you both," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I never planned this. I never wanted to hurt either of you." Vey'na reached out, her hand resting on his. "We know. This world is dangerous. We face death every day. Maybe it makes sense that we cling to whatever warmth we can find." She glanced at Reh'ka, who nodded in agreement. "We can't deny what's happened." Reh'ka spoke softly. "We need to decide if we can move forward, together. This isn't how our people usually form bonds, but our circumstances aren't usual. I've spoken to the elders, and they said that if there is honesty and mutual respect, the tribe will accept whatever we choose." Adrian's heart pounded, tears threatening to blur his vision. He thought of his old vow, the walls he had built around his heart to keep pain at bay, yet here he was, faced with the possibility of love that transcended the ordinary. "If you're both willing," he whispered, "then I am too." They embraced then, a tentative but profound union. The sisters held each other as well, acknowledging the rift that had once stood between them and choosing to heal it. Adrien felt the warmth of their bodies, the steady thrum of their heartbeats, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had a home, a place where he belonged, not out of necessity, but out of genuine love and acceptance. In the days that followed, the tribe celebrated their victory over the manipulative force behind the shardbacks. The wells thrummed with renewed energy, and the settlement thrived. Adrien continued to improve the defenses, ensuring that if any other threat arose, they would be ready. Reh'ka guided the warriors with a newfound sense of balance, allowing Vey'na the freedom to operate in her own style without smothering her. Vey'na, in turn, found that her skills were finally recognized and appreciated by the tribe at large. One evening, as twilight deepened into a sky filled with brilliant stars, Adrien found himself standing between the sisters outside a large tent near the settlement's edge. The tent had once been Reh'ka's, but tonight the atmosphere around it was charged with an unspoken invitation. Vey'na cast a playful smile at her sister. "Sister, you had the human first," she said, recalling the night she had seen them return from the caves, their bond unmistakable. "But he's in my tent tonight." Reh'ka arched an eyebrow, though her lips curved into a smile. "Is that so? I suppose we'll see about that." Adrien laughed softly, warmth flooding him as they led him inside. The flicker of lanterns cast soft patterns on the canvas walls, and the night air carried the scent of the forest's prismatic leaves. Whatever complexities lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by love and forged in the fires of battle. As the tent flaps closed behind them, Adrien realized that for the first time in his life, he felt truly whole, fully alive, cherished by two extraordinary beings who had chosen him, just as he had chosen them. In the quiet that followed, with their bodies pressed close, they spoke of the future. No more secrets, no more lingering resentments. Reh'ka confessed her fears about failing as a leader and a sister. Vey'na admitted she still struggled with the tribe's expectations and her own restless spirit. Adrien shared his nightmares, his guilt, his hopes. In that vulnerability, they found a deeper connection, one that transcended mere physical desire. The tribe, too, saw the change in them. Whispers circulated, but acceptance came swiftly. The sisters had proven their unity, and Adrien had proven his loyalty. The energy wells continued to pulse, a testament to the life force that sustained the planet. The shardbacks, freed from manipulation, returned to their natural habitats, dangerous but no longer tools of a hidden enemy. In the final days of the season, as the leaves shifted from translucent green to a deeper shade that refracted the sunlight into autumnal hues, the elders held a ceremony of gratitude. The entire tribe gathered around the largest well, offering thanks to their ancestors and celebrating the unity that had saved them. Reh'ka, Vey'na, and Adrien stood at the center, hands clasped together, a living symbol of the new bonds that had formed. When the ceremony ended, the tribe parted, leaving the three of them alone by the well's edge. The water at the bottom shimmered with faint, ember-like streaks of energy, reflecting their silhouettes. Adrien felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He turned to the sisters, gently drawing them into an embrace. Their foreheads touched, and he murmured, "I'm home." Reh'ka smiled, the tension that had once shadowed her face replaced by quiet contentment. Vey'na laughed softly, her eyes shining with the joy of a free spirit finally recognized. Together, they looked out at the village they had fought to protect, the place they would build their future. There were no loose ends now, no lingering threats or unanswered questions. Their journey had been harrowing and transformative, and it had led them here, to a love that was as unconventional as it was unbreakable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky exploded in a riot of color, and the wells glowed with gentle radiance, casting the final light of the day across three figures standing as one. And in that luminous twilight, they knew their story had found its true ending, complete, final, and utterly their own.